is National Boyfriend Day, which I thought was really funny. So I do want to wish all of the boyfriends happy Boyfriend Day, but hopefully by the end of the talk, we will have thrown some of these terms into a bit of crisis. Okay. Considerable increase in the visibility of non-monogamous relationships in the discourse on romantic love. Non-monogamists face yet another challenge. As individuals who identify as non-monogamous attempt to have their rights as non-monogamous acknowledged by the society at large, the community faces internal problems that might forestall the advancement of a unified agenda. The discourse in the philosophy of love over monogamy and non-monogamy has largely focused on the moral impermissibility or impermissibility of these relationship styles. When this happens, there's a juxtaposition between monogamy on the one hand and non-monogamy on the other. That is, there's a tendency to justify the permissibility of one of these relationship styles by foregrounding its virtues against the other as its backdrop. As a result, monogamy and non-monogamy are situated as binary opposites, whose opposition play off one another to create a tension between these ways of relating. The preoccupation with this juxtaposition can lead to neglecting important problems that some variations of each relationship styles, monogamies and non-monogamies, share. For example, some argue that insofar as sexual and romantic relationships are an important human good, monogamy's categorical restriction on having additional partners is morally impermissible. Yet, in spite of the fact that this restriction is not exclusive to monogamous relationships, non-monogamous relationships that share this feature have not been problematized in similar ways. In general, many of us would think that there is something morally troubling about friendships that take place with this kind of restraint or constraint on its members. It is at best questionable whether friendships whose members restrict the formation of extra-relational friendships are morally permissible. Why then ought we readily accept this kind of constraint on romantic relationships, whether they are monogamous or non-monogamous? Is there any morally relevant difference between friendships and romantic relationships that could justify these constraints in the case of romantic relationships? The strategy of juxtaposing monogamy against non-monogamy is Janus-faced. On the one hand, critical work on non-monogamy in the philosophy of love challenges many of us to rethink widely accepted narratives about love and romantic relationships, endeavoring toward a fundamental truth about the nature of romantic love. On the other hand, if critical work on non-monogamy is not critical of itself, it risks overestimating the transformative power of non-monogamous romantic relationships, and that it can be thought to have. The latter can be harmful in a variety of ways. It can perpetuate intimate privilege or the privileging of emergent articulations of intimacy as opposed to single intimate factors, extended to monogamies and insular modes of non-monogamy, by masking the fact that not all non-monogamous relationships are morally permissible. Or it can flatten the diversity of experiences and representation of both people who are polyamorous and of polyamorous relationships. Going to be sort of dealing with or working through over the course of this talk is some, I guess, intuitions, but trying to explain away some of the inconsistencies between cases like this, and there's a fourth that will come clearer later on. So case one, X and Y are in a friendship. Imagine further that X and Y have agreed that neither is allowed to have additional friends. Case two, X and Y are in a monogamous romantic relationship, and a fortiori are also friends. Imagine that X and Y have agreed that neither is allowed to have additional friends. Case three, X and Y are in a monogamous romantic relationship and a fortiori are also friends. Imagine further that they have agreed that neither is allowed to have additional romantic or sexual partners. Right, is that many believe in the appropriateness of intimacy confining restraints in romantic relationships, but not necessarily in friendships. I am going to argue that intimacy confining restraints that prevent one's romantic partner from pursuing or establishing additional sexual or romantic relationships is morally impermissible. And we are in Silicon Valley, so I left the typo for proof of humanity. So that should say romantic relationships is morally impermissible. You can never be too sure right here in Silicon Valley. Delay when I click the next slide. Oh, okay, I can just click it. Okay. So in order to try to unlock the transformative potential contained within non-monogamous romantic relationships, we would be best served by viewing monogamy and non-monogamy as aspects of a single system for relating sexually, romantically, socially, and culturally within multiple parts and different articulations. If we don't, we may bypass opportunities to be critical of romantic relationships in ways that promote healthier and morally acceptable romantic relationships. In this paper, I argue that intimacy confining restraints that prevent one's romantic partner from pursuing or establishing extra-relational sexual or romantic relationships is morally impermissible. Before delving into my analysis of monogamous and polyfidelitious romantic relationships, I would like to make a stipulation about my scope. The scope of my analysis focuses more on monogamous and non-monogamous practices and less on monogamous and non-monogamous identities. I generally accept the distinction between romantic identity and romantic practice. In literature on monogamy and non-monogamy, it is common for scholars to either conflate monogamous identity with monogamous practice and non-monogamous identity with non-monogamous practice, or to underspecify which of the two, identity or practice, they are talking about. This kind of ambiguity can be found in the work of Harry Chalmers. For example, in an attempt to represent assumptions that are tethered to monogamy, he writes, quote, "The assumption that one's partner is supposed to meet all of one's personal needs, however, is itself a relic of monogamy. But absent a background of monogamy, the assumption that one's partner is supposed to meet all of one's personal needs collapses," end quote. Chalmers fails to clarify whether the assumption he represents are attendant to monogamous identity or monogamous practices. The lack of clarity here neglects the fact that some might identify as monogamous while practicing non-monogamy, such as adulterers or cheaters, or people who commit to their non-monogamous partners monogamously. It also neglects the fact that some people who identify as non-monogamous also share the assumption that, or also can share the assumption that one's partner is supposed to meet all of one's personal needs in their practices. Additionally, Chalmers' claim also masks the fact that some people who identify as monogamous sometimes engage in consensual non-monogamous activities such as threesomes and swinging, practices that fit more appropriately with the term monogamish. So what I'm trying to point out here is that there seems to be a difference between how people identify and how they go about their relationships. My focus is on the practices themselves, irrespective of how people might identify, right? So I'm hoping that that's clear, and if not, we'll probably have time to double back on it a bit later. Creatures. At any given moment, one's existence is intricately bound up in relationship with others in a myriad of ways. We live in societies alongside others. We have parents that birth us and care for us as we are reared. We pursue, establish, and sustain friendships with others over the course of our lives. Some of us also do the same thing regarding romantic and sexual relationships with others as well. Other things being equal, many of us would think that these relationships are human goods. Setting aside for now the question of whether strangers who share a society can be legibly read as intimate relationships, my informed opinion is that these other sorts of relationships, i.e. familial, friendship, romantic, or sexual, are characteristically thought of as involving some degree of intimacy. Among other things, intimate relationships promote our well-being. In some cases, the intimate relationships we have with others enable the pursuit and realization of our life's most important projects. If it weren't for being cared for by others upon entering into this world, we would have all quickly perished shortly after birth, unable to formulate, let alone pursue ends for ourselves. In other cases, they facilitate our capacities for establishing shared projects, instrumentally positioning us to cultivate other goods like caring for others, cooperating, or fine-tuning our capacity for empathy. Lacking intimate relationships in one or more of their several modes would make our lives intolerably empty. Intimate relationships importantly shape who we are as persons. Intimate relationships are human goods that we want for ourselves. We volitionally choose to pursue and sustain intimate relationships such as friendships, romantic relationships, and sexual relationships. Some choose their family members. We also want this good for others. We are sometimes delighted by the joys that our friends experience from their other friendships. Parents often express excitement when they get news that one of their own children is expecting to bring new life into the world. Some romantic partners are supportive of their partners when they are cultivating new intimate relationships, as in compersion. Intimate relationships contribute to our lives in morally meaningful ways. I have already noted the role that they play in aiding us in the establishment and pursuit of our ends. In intimate relationships, we are also uniquely positioned to honor morally relevant features of the world, such as promise keeping. All else being equal, intimate relationships are human goods that ought to be pursued as agents see fit to pursue them. But this is not always the case. To see this, I would like to focus my attention on a subset of intimate relationships, namely monogamous relationships, polyfidelitious, and polyfidelitious romantic relationships. In a romantic relationship might identify relationally. Monogamous romantic relationships are largely characterized by commitments of exclusivity. In Western societies, monogamous fidelity is often defined in the terms of emotional, romantic, or sexual exclusivity. Admittedly, the concept of exclusivity can be ambiguous about the kinds of temporal restraints lovers are supposed to have. As Sobel writes, someone who asserts that love is exclusive might mean that that X can only love one person, period, or that X can only love one person at a time. Setting this ambiguity aside, suffice it to say that the more commonly assumed meaning is that we ordinarily mean something like the latter when we talk about monogamy. So one at a time and not one for all time, right? Although I did want to point out there being a tension in that ambiguity. Pertaining to the kind of exclusivity that is necessarily required for a romantic relationship to count as monogamous. Below, I explore some of the better known forms of exclusivity, emotional, sexual, and romantic, with hopes of problematizing the ways we think about the moral permissibility of intimacy confining restraints. While the existence of an extra-relational sexual relationship might be easy to track simply by asking someone or asking some partner in a relationship, by asking whether some partner in the relationship is engaging in extra-relational sex with some other person or object, the exclusivity associated with emotionality and relating romantically is in decidedly murkier waters. In order to avoid essentialist concerns about whether monogamy essentially requires a combination of both sexual and emotional exclusivity, or might either of the two be sufficient, I'm stipulating that I understand romantic exclusivity to mean the combination of both sexual and emotional exclusivity in romantic relationships, while allowing that some relationships which require emotional or sexual exclusivity might also be legibly read as monogamous. Regarding emotional exclusivity, monogamous romantic partners sometimes restrict one another from creating and sustaining extra-relational relationships that mimic the intimacy or emotional closeness in one's romantic relationship, or that may involve a consideration of a romantic commitment with the person that the extra-relational relationship is with. Emotional affairs or abuses against a relational requirement of emotional exclusivity are believed to be grounds for the termination of romantic relationships, major disturbances or distractions to one's romantic relationship, and also grounds beliefs for such as feeling betrayed by one's partner. And interestingly, the Journal for American and Family Therapy cited relatively recently that folks have been citing emotional affairs as an increasing contributor to divorces. And so, there is really sort of like a practical motivation, I think, here and uptake. Be that as it may, for some lovers, emotional affairs are just as important as sexual affairs. I'm sorry, I skipped a listen. One might reasonably think that tracking whether one's partner has a relationship that violates this kind of exclusivity is seemingly difficult, insofar as emotional affairs are believed to be less demonstrable than sexual affairs, right? There's no smoking gun. Be that as it may, for some lovers, emotional affairs are just as important as sexual affairs, and as such, they pose similar threats to emotionally exclusive monogamous relationships. In addition to emotional exclusivity, parties to monogamous romantic relationships also often require sexual exclusivity from one another. Reasons for this requirement might vary. Speciality is one reason. People like for their partners to make them feel special. Again, happy boyfriend day. Monogamy inculcates the belief that there is some distinctiveness in being chosen as someone's one and only. Another reason could be concerns about sexual health. The idea here is that maintaining multiple sexual relationships creates riskier conditions for the transmission of sexually transmitted infections. While sexual health is an important concern, as I show later on, it is not sufficient to make this kind of relationship constraint morally permissible. In fact, I will show how these intimacy confining restraints or categorical restrictions on having additional intimate relationships of particular kinds is morally impermissible. Monogamous romantic relationships are not the only kinds of relationships that share this fate. Romantic relationships or closed group romantic relationships are also characterized by exclusivity that involve intimacy confining restraints. Polyfidelitious romantic relationships are romantic relationships comprised of 3 or more people who are committed to each other and are sexually, emotionally, and/or romantically exclusive within their relationship constellation or polycule. So the idea is that there can be a group larger than 2, but the commitments still remain tethered to that group and that group alone. Polyfidelity replaces the bilateral and asymmetrical demand of exclusivity characteristic of a monogamous romantic relationships with a kind of multilateral exclusivity. I think we see this often in the cases of sororities and fraternities or teams, right? Team sports, things like that. Right. People who practice polyfidelity tout their adherence to values like commitment and being faithful to the other partners in their polycule. In addition to their adherence to the values of open and honest communication among the partners in the relationship. In general, polyamory can be thought of as more open in their commitment style than those who practice polyfidelity, right? And both of these are still forms of non-monogamy. Just as monogamy gets juxtaposed to non-monogamy broadly, polyfidelitous relationships are juxtaposed to polyamorous relationships, romantic relationships with multiple people at the same time with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved. Historically, the term polyfidelity has been a site of controversy and resistance within non-monogamous communities themselves. It has had a divisive impact on non-monogamists. Non-monogamists, for example, have made rigid wedge-generating distinctions between polyamory and polyfidelity. A common distinction is that the essential difference between polyamory and polyfidelity is that the polyfidels expect sexual exclusivity within their specific group, and the polyamorists do not. The distinction is found in the fact that polyfidels, the term for someone who is a polyfidelitist, generally expect the people in their group to be sexually exclusive and not to take on additional partners, and polyamorists do not. Consequently, discourses have been created around which of these forms of non-monogamy represents true polyamory and which kinds of non-monogamy can be which kinds of non-monogamy can legitimately carry the label ethical non-monogamy. And non-monogamy are rife with juxtapositions. The juxtapositions typically look like this. Monogamists can be found to look down upon non-monogamists, broadly speaking, i.e. Swingers, polyamorous, and polyfidels, for what they identify as a lack of commitment in their romantic relationships due to their rejection of a dyadic romantic relationship structure. Polyamorists can be found to look down upon monogamists for what they identify as an unhealthy suppression of desire and a lack of courage to engage in open and honest dialogue with their partners surrounding extra-relational desires. Will be found to look down upon polyfidels precisely because of their adherence to the values of committedness and faithfulness that they believe to be relics of monogamy and monogamous culture. Polyfidels can be found to look down on monogamists for similar reasons as polyamorists do. And additionally, they can be found to look down upon polyamorous and other forms of non-monogamy, such as adulterers and swingers, for what they identify as a lack of commitment and faithfulness, read as exclusivity, in their non-monogamous relationship constellation, in spite of their adherence to other shared values, such as open and honest communication among partners in the relationship. So it's a whole lot of finger pointing going on. A lot of people saying our relationship is better than your relationship, and your relationship, and it's a lot of that. When you look at the literature, there's a lot of that finger pointing. And I'm kind of wanting to take a step back and look at the scope and saying, hey, guys, I mean, I think we all kind of get some things wrong here, perhaps. Beyond a bitter bickering over beyond a bitter bickering over ethicality in romantic relationships between the groups, the juxtapositions that are found both throughout the literature on monogamy and non-monogamy and the philosophy of love, and throughout monogamous and non-monogamous communities, point to something larger. The strategies that are employed to demonstrate the ethicality of these intimate relationships reveal something about the backdrop that makes these juxtapositions legible in the first place. Namely, that backdrop is mononormative and amatonormative. Focusing on the interlocking nature of these normativities reveal them as mechanisms working to maintain certain kinds of intimacies, monogamy and polyfidelity, in positions of hegemonic dominance. Amatonormativity and mononormativity bolster the thought that ethically permissible romantic relationships are committed and fidelitous, read sexually and romantically exclusive. Amatonormativity is a term coined by feminist philosopher Elizabeth Brake to represent the default assumptions that central monogamous, romantic, and usually heterosexual relationships that lead to marriage are the ideal form of romantic relationships and a universally shared goal. Mononormativity is the dominant discourse of monogamy, which is reproduced and perpetuated in everyday conversation and saturates mainstream media depictions. Where the two interlock is that both involve, to some degree, an exaltation of exclusivity due to an allegiance to monogamy and monogamous culture. Because of this, discursive objects that are disseminated socially and politically about romantic relationships, such as marriage magazines, romantic comedies, love songs across multiple genres, that they feature relationships that are dyadic, monogamous, and exclusive, and they will exhibit a tendency to jointly propagate values of ethicality at the expense of other intimate relationships that are non-monogamous. The two also diverge slightly. Mononormativity focuses on addressing the specificity of hegemonic monogamy without much regard to the importance of one's romantic relationship. It gives some priority to this importance, right? One relies on a reference to marriage. In fact, the other doesn't, right? Because you can have marriage-like relationships that are just monogamous but don't aim to be married. So I employ both of these terms as a way of capturing that class of both marriage and marriage-like relationships. These two forces, they reinforce a system of intimate privilege, understood as the privileging of emergent articulations of intimacy as opposed to single intimate factors that privileges exclusive forms of intimate relationship structures over non-exclusive forms of intimate relationship structures, such as adultery, polyamory, and friendships. And again, to call back to my focus on non-monogamous practices, I'm not really making a distinction between what people have been calling ethical or consensual non-monogamy and non-monogamy broadly speaking. So that is why you hear the sort of repetition of adultery as being among that class, right? It's a non-monogamy, in fact, and I think it's being a non-monogamy is what prompts people to make the qualification of ethical non-monogamy as opposed to just calling it non-monogamy, right? So sometimes people get tripped up over that. So are you saying that cheating is open? No, I'm not, right? Nathan Ram Buchanan writes that we can think of, Nathan Ram Buchanan writes that we can think of, what we can think of in isolation as monogamy is merely one surface of a more complex non-monogamous system that structures much of how we configure and even strive to refigure intimate relations. Instead of juxtaposing monogamies and non-monogamies, this broader system of non-monogamy is one that places them on one and the same spectrum of intimate relationships. Ram Buchanan writes that monogamy and non-monogamy are less binary opposites, an opposed pair whose sides play off each other, than they are two aspects of a single system for relating sexually, romantic, socially, and culturally within multiple parts and different articulations. Holding this concept of non/monogamy in the backdrop of discussions about intimate privilege is useful because it is a singular thread that runs through monogamies and non-monogamies alike. By cutting across the fabricated distinctions by which we see ourselves as having membership in one or the other, it enables the recognition that evaluative judgments associated with intimate privilege are made possible only through the systematic entanglement of both monogamies and non-monogamies. In linking the issue of privilege with that of intimate relationships, Ram Buchanan's analysis nuances our understanding of intimate relationships, and we come to see them as overlapping with, as opposed to being independent of, one another. Furthermore, by helping us foreground the good treatment that privileged intimacies are the beneficiaries of, it has the crystallizing effect of situating our understanding of intimate privilege into finer relief. And so the idea here is, under like default logics, people want to separate monogamies, polyamories, and polyfidelities or other kinds of non-monogamies as different kinds of thing, right? So in arguments, commonplace arguments, you hear people just saying, well, they're just different, right? But when pressed to ask to provide an account for their difference, some of those reasons that get employed often come up short. What Ram Buchanan's work does is says that no, all of these relationships are the same in kind, even if they differ by distance, like of closeness, or are characterized by different activities. He just refers to them all as kinds of intimate relationships. And that allows us to sort of evaluate intimate relationships, not in a way that pits monogamy against non-monogamy simply, but that even allows us to compare non-monogamies to one another and to themselves, because we're talking about this broader spectrum of intimate relationships, okay? And I think that that's useful, right? I think that that's useful, and I think that it gets us, I think it gets non-monogamous communities away from this practice of virtue signaling, when treating sort of monogamous or monogamy as their backdrop, right? Or even trying to demonstrate their humanity through appeals to shared values and things like that. Right? So I explained that, and that sets up like the move. So we started by putting these cases up, and they recur here. Monogamous romantic relationships and non-monogamous romantic relationships and friendships all exist along the same spectrum of intimate relationships. So we're now in a position to see the moral impermissibility of intimacy confining restraints by imagining a few cases. Case one, X and Y are in a friendship. Imagine further that X and Y have agreed that neither is allowed to have additional friends. Case two, X and Y are in a monogamous romantic relationship, and a fortiori, they're also friends. Imagine further that X and Y have agreed that neither is allowed to have additional friends. Y are in a monogamous romantic relationship, and a fortiori are also friends. Imagine further that they have agreed that neither is allowed to have additional romantic or sexual partners. Intuitively, many of us would think that cases 1 and 2 are morally troubling. As I stated earlier, friendships are a human good. Whether we are in a romantic relationship or a friendship, friendships are a human good that we should desire for others to have in their lives as they see fit. And morally palatable. I'm sorry. Sorry. In morally palatable circumstances, X would want Y to have the goods of friendship in their life. If X lacks a positive desire for Y to have these goods in their life, X should at the very least want Y's pursuit of such goods to be as least cumbersome as possible. Making the pursuit of these goods as least cumbersome as possible involves X's refraining from imposing undue costs on Y, enabling Y to pursue these goods as Y sees fit. If Y desires to pursue friendships or becomes friends with someone, Z, outside of their romantic relationship with X, then X should not impose costs on Y for doing so, including X withdrawing their love, affection, or willingness to continue the relationship. There may seem to be nothing that is morally suspect about X's and Y's romantic relationship being exclusive in this way. Yet, sexual and romantic relationships are also human goods. They may contribute to our well-being by providing emotional closeness, sexual pleasure, or by helping us learn more about ourselves. Because of this, we may instead suspect that X should be happy for and supportive of Y's establishing extra-relational relationships that are romantic, sexual, or both. X, Y, and Z are in a non-monogamous romantic relationship, and a fortiori are also friends. Imagine further that they have agreed that no party to the romantic relationship is allowed to have additional romantic or sexual partners. Case 4 differs from case 3 in that it presents a romantic relationship that is non-monogamous in configuration, a kind of polycule. However, cases 3 and 4 are similar in that they both contain similar intimacy confining restraints, namely that the partners in the romantic relationship are restricted from pursuing or establishing extra-relational relationships that are romantic or sexual. One might be inclined to think that this kind of restriction placed upon the relationships in cases 3 and 4 are morally permissible because the mode of romantic relationship is itself sufficient to justify the insularity in the service of protecting already existing romantic relationships. But it is not clear that the cases 3 and 4 differ from the morally troublesome case 2. The task would be to find a morally relevant difference between cases 2 and cases 3 and 4. However, this may be more difficult than it might seem on its face. I will address 2 standard strategies for carving out morally, or I will address a couple of common strategies for carving out morally relevant differences between friends and romantic partners. Appeals to specialness, appeals to sex, appeals to jealousy, and appeals to impracticality. So it may be thought that there are no good reasons to restrict one's friends or partners from having additional friends. However, there are good reasons to restrict one's partners from having more than one romantic or sexual relationship at a time. When we choose to enter into romantic relationships with some people and not others, it is because they are special. The belief here is that we choose our romantic partners because of their distinctive value qua romantic partner. This distinctive value is believed to be enough to justify intimacy confining restraints. However, if having one partner or a select insulated few partners make for a romantic relationship, a more special romantic relationship, and this value is enough to justify intimacy confining restraints against pursuing additional relationships of the same kind, then it is curious why the distinctive value that friendships have would not justify a similar restraint in the case of friendship as in case 1, right? Because our friends are special too, right? But we don't tend to say that because our friends are special, they can't have any other friends. And I'm anticipating the peanut gallery talking a bit about, well, best friendships do function in that way. And we can talk about the reasonableness of those expectations and the moral permissibility of those expectations in Q&A as well. Okay. Distinctive value could not justify the restraint in case one, as it is far from clear how having additional friendships would make any particular friendship less special. It is possible for relationships that exist in the same mode to each have their own distinctive value without calling into question the speciality of other relationships existing in that mode. There is no good reason to think that insulating one's romantic relationship with such a restraint, as is present in cases 3 and 4, makes one's romantic relationship more special. Another strategy is to appeal to the fact of sexual activity in romantic relationships. I should note here that this strategy is not altogether unrelated to the appeal to distinctive value. When an appeal is made to index the distinctive value had by romantic relationships, this is sometimes what is meant, right? It's because these relationships have sex, for example. Be that as it may, this might be why cases 1 and 2 seem more troubling than cases 3 and 4. I'll go back just to kind of get them on the screen. The appeal to sex has multiple parts. One, and that's not like the pun not intended. One might mean that romantic relationships are partly based on sex, and that makes them more distinctively valuable. However, the logic applied against the appeal to distinctive value applies to this case as well. Additionally, though, it would seem that a distinctively valuable romantic relationship without the possibility of sex is possible, as in the case of differently able-bodied persons, or as in the cases of romantic relationships among people who are asexual. It should also be noted that sometimes friendships also involve sex. This may or may not make those friendships more distinctively valuable. The appeal to sex also sometimes is an appeal to a risky behavior, right, or unwanted pregnancy. Concerns about sexual health are serious, but it's not clear that this concern is sufficiently wide enough to capture the full range of restrictions that are typically bound up in restraining oneself from pursuing a sexual or romantic relationship with someone else. The restraint might involve foregoing attending a social event, say bowling, to forestall the possibility of interacting with others whom one might potentially sexually or romantically relate, right? Just hold yourself up in a room forever, right? Also, for non-monogamous practitioners in developed societies with access to contraception, protection, and sexual health assessment mechanisms, it is questionable whether this concern is sufficient to justify this restraint. Aside this point is the fact that many activities that people find worthwhile have risk associated with them, such as driving, flying, etc., etc. Yet they are still worth doing. It is not clear that the concern from sexual health is sufficient to justify this intimacy confining restraint. Include an appeal to jealousy, and I'm sort of being mindful of time, so I'll kind of blow through the jealousy and impracticality responses very quickly. The idea is that relationships might include or introduce intimacy confining restraints as a way of forestalling the possibility of jealousy. But again, I should just point out very quickly here that this is not always a successful mechanism. Jealousy still emerges within the context of monogamous relationships. Jealousy still emerges within the context of friendships. Jealousy still emerges within the context of co-working relationships, so on and so forth, right? So the introduction of an intimacy confining restraint as an attempt to forestall the possibility of this type of jealousy emerging seems ineffective, right? The other bit is to talk about impracticality and saying that we are limited creatures, limited agents. Our time, energy, and attention, which I call tea, is limited. You can only pour so much tea into certain cups, right? But an appeal to the fact of our finite natures doesn't justify having a restriction imposed on one's relationship more than it does call us as individuals to be mindful of what our bandwidth might be. And perhaps I don't know, admitting that, admitting our inability to pursue additional relationships, which doesn't necessarily show up as an intimacy confining restraint, for example. Small caveat, and this is what I was on about just a second ago. I do think that there is a distinction between what we might think of as relationship confining restraints that are imposed from the outside, say by a partner or by social, like unquestioned social norms as treated as default, other than, that on the one side, and then sort of what appear to be intimacy confining restraints that emerge from inside, where like parties to the relationship negotiate and accept an explicit agreement for their relationship to not, I don't know, include more intimate relationships, sexual or romantic. Why I think this differs only slightly is that, you know, this is more of like an agreement-based constraint, and it's not like an imposition imposed from the outside, or asymmetrically, like one party imposing it on the other, so on and so forth. It seems like the parties all agree to it, right? But I do think that when we probe a little bit further and ask why we think we might want to come to terms with these types of agreements, we have to be very careful as to not be appealing to the same kinds of things that we see emerging with the imposition from the outside, right? So our rationales should do as best they can to steer clear, relying on social scripts for meaningfulness, speciality, value, sexual health, so on and so forth, as a way of justifying why these types of constraints show up as appealing to us, right? Okay. I have suggested that monogamous romantic relationships and some non-monogamous romantic relationships, such as polyfidelitious romantic relationships, have more in common than they're typically thought to have. The realization that romantic relationships are a kind of intimate relationship amongst a plurality of other kinds of intimate relationships, such as friendships, emphasizes the point that intimate relationships can be understood as existing on a spectrum. Rand Buchanan calls this spectrum the non/monogamy spectrum. This spectrum reveals how some forms of intimate relationships, such as monogamous romantic relationships and polyfidelitous romantic relationships, are beneficiaries of intimate privilege. It also shows how monogamy and polyfidelity function to uphold morally problematic normative structures like amatonormativity and mononormativity. In order to highlight and address ways that monogamies and non-monogamies can both function to uphold these normativities in similar ways, I focused on the extent to which both may contain intimacy confining restraints. A closer look at these intimacy confining restraints that are characteristic of some monogamies and non-monogamies showed that there is no good reason to prevent one's partner from pursuing the human goods of sexual and romantic relationships as they see fit, and that to do so is morally impermissible. This analysis gets us past comparisons of monogamies and non-monogamies that frame them as binary opposites in tension with one another, and move us closer to understanding what morally palatable romantic relationships should involve, no matter if their structure is monogamous or non-monogamous in form. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So do you want a short break before Q&A, or are you ready to just dive in?
We can dive in. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. I'll keep the queue since I can also see the people on Zoom. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and then I'll call. And if you're on Zoom and you want to ask a question, like do the raise hand thing, and then I'll tell you when it's your turn.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some friendships include sex.
Yeah.
Would that not be just a romantic?
I think that friendships would fall into that category for sure. And I think ultimately that is going to depend on what conditions we establish for what constitutes a romantic relationship. And I think that those are various, but I do think that it is possible for an aromantic relationship to be the kind of friendship that does involve sex, as in the case of friends with benefits, for example, which is a bit clunky term because friendships just have benefits, right? And so, you know, as a sort of index or designation for sex, it gets really, really, really interesting. And I also don't want to disallow the possibility for the concept of romantic friendships, which we see sort of like language emerging for. People are using that characterization to describe how some of their friendships exist. And so I want to sort of like be able to accommodate both of those, which again, for me, is why the appeal to the non/monogamy spectrum in situating all intimate relationships on one and the same spectrum is really, really useful. So yeah. And yeah.
The establishment that the couple.
I'm sorry, say that
It's
again.
the establishment that the people who are in relationships make, so they either decide to be in a friendship or decide to end it. That's not really much to do with sexual.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand those things. It's sort of like social monikers that are useful tools for conveying meaning in a society that is already mononormative and so on and so forth. And there's a ton of this stuff like boyfriends, girlfriends, so on and so forth. But I also think that this is why non-monogamous or amongst non-monogamous communities, it's more common to use terms like partner, significant other, or others, so on and so forth, because of the way of kind of distancing ourselves from relying on those very same scripts and maybe inviting questions to probe what the nature of those relationships actually involve. And I may very well be talking to someone who, when describing my relationship to them, say to me, oh, well, that's basically a romantic relationship, right? Or that's just a friendship, right? And I just am like, whatever, you know, I've sort of exhausted myself in explaining what this relationship involves. Take whatever label, you know.
We'll go Stefano and then Janet. Also, can the people asking questions in this room like speak up so the people on Zoom can hear your question? Yeah.
So you talk a little bit about best friends, and I don't see how there's some sort of element of exclusivity there, especially on the grounds of speciality, right? People generally speaking are perceived to not have more than one best friend. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand the idea of best friends.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's actually common for people to have more than one best friend. I mean, I think that is where, for me, the ambiguity emerges. I mean, I've come from communities where it's like, this is my best friend, this is my best friend, this is my best friend, and people are always like, well, there can be only one best understood as an absolute term. But I'd also wonder, sort of, again, if we're situating relationships on one and the same spectrum, how is it that the tension gets relaxed between people who are monogamous and married to their best friend, for example, quote unquote, also have best platonic friends outside of the marriage, right? So again, I think that would also be demonstrative of a multiplicity of kinds of best friends. And if it is, so I'll say that first. Next, I'll say, and if it is the case that best friends come to be characterized by these intimacy confining restraints such that one can have only one best friend, I think I'd find myself criticizing that approach to best friendship in much the same way as I approach criticizing intimacy confining restraints, right? I think that that's a sort of, to be crass, maybe a little bit more of a ridiculous characterization of friendship or best friendship because of the way that it reifies problematic values like possession and possessiveness that I think we do better or best to kind of always be moving a bit away from. So yeah, does that speak to the question?
I think so.
Janet?
So I guess I wanna, and actually I'm gonna do this in the context of friendship.
Nice.
I guess there's a piece of me that is not convinced that some intimacy confining restraints might not be morally permissible. For example, I would find it very, very hard to be in a friendship with someone whose additional friends included Nazis, like real Nazis. And so there's, you know, my intuition at least would be to say, you know, go out with other friends, other friendships, but not Nazis. And maybe if my friends are like, I got it, this is a human good I must pursue, is the opportunity to be friends with Nazis. I think I would say, okay, you're gonna have that, but you're no longer gonna have friendship with me.
And I think at that point, what we could just, I have two things to say here. The first is that we could understand that as a friendship then no longer existing, sort of being severed by the decision for them to make this pursuit. And you're still making that as least cumbersome as possible by removing yourself from that situation. So I think that is an important point and consistent with the argument that I've tried to advance, as well as saying, I am trying, I guess, my best to avoid thinking about intimacy as a zero-sum game. And so I can understand that if we still want to call it a semblance of a friendship, even after a decision like that is made, I think my account might entail that we come to characterize that relationship as having just far less degree of intimacy, as is the case, for example, with, I don't know, citizens of America at this present time, and also citizens of South Africa at this time, right? I do think that there's I think people might say that this is a weird way of speaking and saying, well, that human species on the planet Earth and this other human species on the planet Earth exist in an intimate relationship. I think that there are ways of probing sort of global dependencies that could help us elaborate argument where there existing some degree of intimacy, even if not very robust. And so even in that case, I don't know that I'd be convinced that what we have in this case is an intimacy confining restraint more than a personal boundary, as opposed to, unless you are saying of your friend that you cannot have, or like an ultimatum or something
Like
like
you
that.
have to choose between these human goods.
I
You can
see.
be friends with the Nazis, or you could be friends with me, and part of that has to do with
Mhm.
the human goods I am seeking.
Good, yeah, yeah, I do think that that would be problematic as framed as an ultimatum, as opposed to using language that would suggest if you were to pursue what you take to be this good, that making I statements and saying that I could no longer be your
Yeah.
friend. And I do think that that makes an important difference, I think, in what might be right or wrong with how we go about relating to others.
Okay,
Yeah.
and actually, I am intrigued that the I statement in articulating the boundary could be relevant ethically,
Yes.
which is, yeah, thank you.
That's the imposition of constraining what one can or can't do, which, going back to the point about possession, we also want to get away from controlling others, right? But not compromising our own autonomy to govern ourselves, right? I think is a way that I would go about, yeah. Yeah.
Follow up on
Okay.
this interchange, and then other people should not be shy and like come up with their questions. I'm curious about the way you responded to Janet, and also I think this goes back to the inside-outside distinction that you made.
Yeah, yeah.
So I am very like sympathetic to the main thrust of the argument. And what I'm curious about is whether it seems like this response plus the inside-outside distinction still leaves room for people to do something that starts to look a lot like monogamy and having the like condition 3, which is that it seems like a lot of people will just go, okay, it's like, I don't want to like confine you in any way. You should do whatever you want. But it's like important to me that I be like the only sexual partner. And like, if that's not the situation, I might have trouble staying in this relationship. And like do so maybe not in like an ultimatum threatening way, but just setting their own boundary. And often that seems like how maybe I shouldn't say all, but like, that seems like how a lot of like default monogamy relationships occur is like, for both people, it's better to be in the relationship and not pursue like side relationship or sexual relationships because they know it's important to the other person, but not necessarily because like they on their own would prefer that situation.
Yeah, no, that's true. And they are going to look a lot alike. So, I think also what you're touching on though is sort of like the proximity of, I don't argue for this in this paper and I might want to follow up on this thought at a later time. But just sort of like the proximity of, I don't know, desires that can be found amongst classes or scores of monogamous persons. The proximity of that and like cowardice, I think, and sort of like thinking about polyamory or non-monogamy, ethical non-monogamy, whatever, consensual non-monogamy, as having maybe a closer proximity to courage. And why I say that is because in the cases that you've described, yeah, I don't necessarily think about those relationships as framed as problematic, right? You have people governing themselves, saying and effectively communicating, in fact, what they believe themselves to be able to sort of put up with, be able to do or not do. And then the other agent or agents responding to that, right? Hopefully as autonomous agents themselves, and will have to be sort of accountable for those decisions. But I don't know that I'm comfortable like saying that, those people like don't really like exist. Cause I mean, I do think that they do. I don't know, like, it would be an empirical question, I guess, as to how many people actually like, say, well, look, you can do what you want. I'm just saying for myself, I'd have to go if these things are like the case. This is just my own personal thing. I think it's up to other parties at that point to be courageous in making that value assessment in determining an aim for their own life, I guess. Yeah. I don't know if that speaks directly to it, but it strikes me as like, and as you were like saying, it's like, yeah, are we just talking about cowards? People who, cowards and sort of like through subterfuge kind of manipulating in a particular way, this idea of like, I went to, Clardy's talk and I saw if I made I statements, I really can backdoor an ultimatum in there. Yeah, I'm not advocating for that, right? But if we are sort of in good faith, taking the person's expression to be genuine, earnest, and honest, I don't know that we can do anything more than that. And I mean, I think that dating, loving, caring, especially in relationships that are voluntarily chosen, do involve incompatibilities. Sometimes it really does take conversations like the kind that you brought up here to reveal that layer of incompatibility or a level of incompatibility to a certain extent. It might not mean or need to mean the end of a relationship, but perhaps a relationship where the kinds of activities that would now come to characterize maintaining the intimacy already present in that relationship take on a new shape, right? And so it could be the case of like, okay, are you saying that if I have sex with other people, you can't relate to me full stop? Or are you saying something more specific and saying that if you relate sexually to other people, I am not comfortable with relating to you sexually, which doesn't throw the entire relationship away at the moment of alleged incompatibility is encountered. I think instead it presents more constructive ways for encountering incompatibility whilst sustaining as robust of an intimate relationship as we can with whomever or whatever party that might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, yeah. Wait, is it a follow-up or?
No.
Okay, we'll go Michael, then Carlos.
I incredibly, I appreciate the means in which you were approaching this Thank you very much. I identify with the like complexities of basing like an ethical evaluation away from assumption. And I think that like non-monogamous practices require that you set aside set aside the assumption, set aside the heteronormative, like self-proclaimed, like assumptions of like you should just always assume, you never have to have this discussion that if you're in a relationship with a person, if you develop a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship with someone, that monogamy is the like default. I like when thinking of like a compassion-based ethics or like ethics of care or like a bell hooks perspective on like getting away from like the patriarchal structures, I like listening to the questions, it's all like having a lot of philosophers in the room means that typically a lot of minds are trying to not think within like these restrictions, like our white heteronormative patriarchy is in fact like the default in the room, but rather that like we're trying to deconstruct that and also assimilate the idea that communication on the basis of a compassionate I, like not only not othering yourself, but like being compassionate and self-explorative about like, what I want or need is actually a consideration required to participate in ethical relationships,
Period.
regardless
Yeah.
if they're friendships or if they're like romantic. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, no, that's exactly right, right? And again, you know, I call it bitter bickering in the paper, right? Because so much of the literature to this point has proceeded on like monogamous calling out non-monogamous and hating, and then, you know, non-monogamous either fighting back or trying to fight back through a kind of warped respectability politics, which is the case of polyfidels, I think. And, you know, polyamory, for example, often gets conflated with polygamy, polygyny, and polyandry, all of which are marriage structures, which align more neatly with polyfidelity than they do maybe with polyamory. And so there are these ways of, I don't know, getting lost, or what's important getting lost in this sort of binary discourse that seems to be happening. And I have sought out places for intervention in the literature that tries as best I can to help push us past that in the service of the betterment of relationships, period, right? It's not about monogamy versus non-monogamy, as you know, it's about what is the good relationship, you know, or what are the sets of good relationships, right? And so in that way, yeah, it does reflect the kinds of postures we see care ethicists taking, compassion ethicists taking. Yeah, I'm steeped in some of that tradition. Yeah, for sure.
Carlos.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it. I am somebody's husband. And I was thinking about.
That's not your day.
I was thinking if she was here, she would be like, give me a death stare. I'm glad she's not here. But I just want to ask, let's say that somebody in your audience were to ask you or comment on the certain the fact that that your position reflects a certain privileged position politically, from the standpoint of maybe reflecting a liberal Western view on human relationships. What would you say to that person? Because it seems to me, at least, that it would be, I mean, ultimately, we could get into the weeds about certain forms of relativism and cultural practices that would be very resistant to a view like this. So anyways, I guess my question is, what would you say to somebody that gave propose that critique to you?
Yeah, I appreciate the sort of probing here, and there's a lot that I could say. I will probably try to say, I'll try to keep it as, how much time we got? as short as I can, and, oh, we got time. Yeah, so I'll say maybe 2 or 3 things. The first is sympathetic to the fact that this view that I'm advancing reflects privilege, precisely because I conceive of persons across all sort of like cultures, socioeconomic classes, races, so on and so forth, as having friendships and families, which are intimate relationships. So I don't think that to attend to those relationships already existing a little bit differently is necessarily reflective of privilege in this, because this kind of perspective sometimes emerges when you're trying to advance the case of like having, in fact, multiple wives or something like that, right? People say, well, you know, that might be related to sort of wealth. You got to be able to afford it, so on and so forth, right? I'm not necessarily advancing or advocating for any relationship of any particular kind other than intimate, right? I'll try to like scale it all the way back and just say intimate relationship. And I think what we find then is that these perspectives are reflected in communities that within the dominant Western structure, within the dominant Western liberal structure have existed outside of it, like indigenous communities, right? As the work of Kim Tallbear, I think, reflects, but then also like African Americans, for example, who through the domestic slave trade were either forced to participate in non-monogamous relationships because the wombs of slave women were land gapes as a way of increasing capital, or when, you know, the domestic slave trade would move different slaves and people would then find themselves in non-monogamous relationships of their own choosing, right? And so when I see the existence of what one scholar calls polyaffectivity, sort of like the ability to be affectionate with just more than one person, whether they be family, friends, romantic, so on and so forth at a time, I look at communities whose identities have been forged against the Western colonial liberal tradition and find these practices, just historically speaking, I'll say, right? I don't want to naturalize it like the Supreme Court does in Reynolds v. the United States, right? Where they say non-monogamy is, you know, native to Asiatic and African peoples, you know, and this is a Supreme Court case that is still the precedent, you know, of resistance against non-monogamous or plural marriage, for example, right? I'm not trying to naturalize it there, because whether it be by choice, as in the case of indigenous, finding residents within like indigenous communities and ways of relating, or if it's sort of like forged in response to oppression, anti-Black oppression, so on and so forth. I mean, the community, it take, you know, the phrase, it takes a community to raise a family, so on and so forth. I mean, I think that communities who actually haven't enjoyed the privilege of, I guess, promised to you by Western liberalism, I don't know. I guess I would implore them to revisit the archive and read it with a new lens. And so I guess the charge would then be the approach to the archives, if understanding them in that way, is one that imports a lens of colonialism, liberalism, so on and so forth, and doesn't allow oneself to get behind the prose in that way, maybe so in the mind of those generating those thoughts or experiences or so on. And this is not going to be the same for any and all communities, but I only mention these to say that it does find a home in communities that we would be hard pressed to say are the beneficiaries of Western liberal colonial privilege, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Now there's a queue. So you're gonna go first, and then you're second, and you're third.
Awesome.
Well, Justin, love the talk. I love the case setup. I think it really makes it very compelling, or comparing the romantic to the friendship. Brings up a number of things for me, like one, how much pressure there is to call your spouse your best friend.
Yeah.
And just how much that like is out there. Like, you don't, and it also sort of makes me think like in the majority of my close friends from like my hometown growing up, more of them are divorced than are still in married monogamous relationships. And in talking to many of them, it seems like they're saying something like, we're no longer friends. So in bringing this comparison, I think it's really compelling, but it brings up a question for me. I wonder, is the restraints impairing the friendship or the romantic side? Because I like that you were bringing up this, like, they're a monogamous thing, and a fortiori, they're also friends.
Mhm.
And I also wonder how many times like married couples are actually still friends. And I mean, it sounds rough to say, I suppose, but in my family and friends and like the broader sort of experience I have, like a lot of them, like, yeah, they're in a relationship. They don't really feel like they're still friends.
Yeah, it just sounds like there's a thicker conception of friendship here. And I think that we're gonna see variance across people around like how thick or thin their conception of friendship is. Which is why I try to get away from those labels and just talk in terms of intimacy, right? Because whether or not the spouses or former spouses find themselves to be friends, I don't even want to get into that conversation. I'll leave that for Aristotle, right? Book 10 of the Nick Ethics, right? Hey, go figure that out. But for me, it's just like the question is whether or not these two exist in an intimate relation. I think for me, I say yes. The degree to which that intimacy is, it needn't be robust, right? As I was saying a bit earlier, right? I think that even at the broadest level of like global dependency or something like that, which is again common amongst care ethicists and things like that. I mean, I do think that we could find a legitimate way of characterizing that relationship as involving some degree of intimacy, even if not a friendship, right? Because growing up, we had this distinction too between like, that's not my friend, that's my associate.
Sure.
And I'm just like, what the, like, you know what I mean? I think when we're doing that, we're playing a weird language game that the weight of the liberal state is actually behind, right? Which also goes to the earlier point of trying to not say boyfriend, girlfriend, right? But say partner, significant other. And even those are imperfect. I use relata, right? Literally, person with whom I'm in a relation. Now, if you want to probe further as to, well, what do you mean by relata? Now we're having the right kinds of conversation as opposed to allowing a label to carry with it these default set of assumptions that I think just get in the way more times than not. So, I refer to what some would call my friends as relata. I refer to what some would call my partners as relata. I refer to my coworker I refer to whom some might call my coworkers as relata, right? Because I'm not losing any truth in that. These are bodies of people, whatever, that I relate to. Now, if folks are more interested in what activities or what terms, right, come to shape that particular relationship, I'm happy to talk more about that. And if at the end of that conversation, they say, oh, so you guys are friends, right? Again, I'm just gonna be like, I guess,
Sure.
like, I don't have a dog in that fight.
Yeah. One short follow-up. And maybe you already sort of said this, like, what would you say is like the thinnest or shallowest form of intimacy? Because if it's just, we exist at the same time on the planet, that seems really, really thin to me and almost like too weak.
Yeah.
So I just want to know if that's what you're committed to or not.
Almost. I mean, I do think that once we introduce notions of dependency that way, I do think that it thickens up just a little bit, right? And I think that we could think about these kinds of rationales as motivating concerns around large global issues like global warming, for example, right? I mean, there's one way we might understand that as being directed toward the Earth itself, right? I'm not trying to take a stance right now on whether or not the Earth as an object one could stand into an intimate relationship with. I mean, again, I think that there are perspectives though, especially among sort of like indigenous philosophy, where you might find that, right? So I'm not closed off to that possibility, but I do think that if we do think in those terms, Yeah, I mean, I actually think that that's actually rather thick, you know, because perhaps it is the thinner version of intimacy that, again, or that doubles down on our individuatedness from others, that motivates, like, you know, concern for self, or I'm gonna throw this cup out the window on my drive because I don't give a damn about littering, so on and so forth, right? I think that these are failures of care, right? Failures to care for others that you share this planet with. And for me, I think I gain a way of talking about that in more compelling ways that position people to have to confront their moral obligations, you know? So yeah, I mean, but I appreciate that. I do think that for some that would seem really thin, but I think that it only shows up or appears thin for those interested in preserving some thicker account, where that thicker account might itself be a relic of Western liberal colonialism.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to have that fight with them, right? Yeah, I'm happy to, yeah.
Great.
Oh, yeah, great. Hi, thank
Hi.
you for your talk.
Thank you.
Cool, so I have a question that I know that you answered somewhere in the talk, but I'm hoping that you could just parse it simply as possible, for those of us who are reading through this. Okay, so my question is, what do you take to be the difference between ethical non-monogamy and unethical monogamy? In my mind, both actually act as resistance to social scripts. And so I wanted to know if there was a way to like simply parse it. Ethical non-monogamous and just like an unethical monogamous.
Yeah, good. So I don't.
Except this part. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
you're right. Like you can just be like, okay, one's like a bad person, but
Yeah, I mean, because I take monogamy to be characterized, like the practice itself, to be characterized by intimacy, confining, restraints, I don't know that there is a form of ethical monogamy to begin with. I do think that you can have dyadic relationships with two and only two people. If it turns out that, I don't know, bandwidth is a thing, or I don't know, like you just simply can't relate to other people. But I do think that that is different than what what I believe characterizes the institution of monogamy, which is sort of characterized by these constraints, and tells folks that if you are doing this, it's a condition. If you are doing this, right, then you can't be doing this, right? I think that is, at the source of sort of like why I'm wanting to say that. I don't know if there are any ethical monogamies, which is to not say that there aren't ethical relationships of two and only two people. But I do think if those relationships between two, and maybe at the time or at the moment of only two people, are characterized by an openness that doesn't preclude the pursuit of other relationships, I guess I'm wanting to say that that would be the ethical monogamy, but then we're going to be into like a conceptual battle of like, well, how is that monogamy if there is no like confined like barriers to it? Like that just seems like an open relationship in principle. And I'm saying, yeah, that's the point. That's how we get to ethical, right? And so when it comes to sort of like ethical non-monogamy, I don't know that I'm also invested in that as much. I think in most of my writing, I'm more inclined to talk about monogamy broadly, and am sure to include adultery and cheating, for example, as versions of non-monogamy, because I, along with folks like Ray Briggs, who writes this paper called "Should Monogamy Be Should Non-Monogamy Be Consensual?" I think it's a really good paper in the Journal of Applied Philosophy. Yeah, I often question what that qualification is doing. And so you're right. And earlier in the talk, I did say that, you know, I think my approach helps us tap deeper into the transformative potential of non-monogamies. I think a non-monogamy interested in qualifying or performing itself as an ethical non-monogamy is ultimately reproducing the same hierarchy that we find already existent between monogamy and non-monogamy. And so they don't quite get away from that performance, which is why I'm just like, eh. So yeah, does that help speak to it a little bit?
I think so. I mean, the way that I was understanding was it's something like the question cannot be applied to be, like for some people asking the question, what is ethical capitalism?
Mhm.
And so a lot of people would just be like, let's like
Yeah, exactly.
no way to get to the ethical part of
Yeah.
capitalism once we're really thinking about what it Okay, so you're saying something similar.
Yeah, I think I would say, to continue on that, I think we might talk in terms of ethically intimate or ethical intimate relationships, right? And I think that all of those will be characterized by lacking this condition of an intimacy confining restraint. So whether or not that then comes to occupy the category of monogamous or not, hey, again, somebody else can pick that one. Yeah.
Oh, wait, sorry, there is a new person wanting to ask a question, and then we can circle back.
So while you were talking, I Googled your book and I bought it on Kindle.
Thank you.
And there was another book that follows up on the person before me's question called The Ethical Slut. I didn't buy that one yet.
Yeah, don't buy that one. Yeah.
But here's my question.
Right.
The dominant view in Christianity condemns non-monogamous relationship. Most of this is based on the kind of interpretation of the creation account in Genesis and the words of Jesus in the New Testament that describe marriage as a union with one, in the text, man and one woman. As you imply, non-monogamous arrangements are often characterized as forms of adultery or sexual immorality. I don't know if you said that part right. The Bible does, however, contain accounts of polygamy practices by figures such as Abraham, Jacob, and even David. Do you foresee a time when the view that it's not that it's okay not to be monogamous will be accepted in mainline Christianity?
That's good. So yeah, mainline is the operative word though, because there are some churches that are queer friendly, LGBTQ friendly, and I do think that you find it there. And also certain humanist approaches, I think, to Christianity are sympathetic to non-monogamy. Probably not. I do think that the identity of Christians is deeply entrenched in Scripture, such that to arrive at a less traditional interpretation of Scripture might bring about like an identity crisis in a really serious way, right? I say that on the one hand, I think you're right to sort of point out that there is polygamy present in the Bible, but we get in Exodus through the 10 Commandments, the sort of like indictment from God that monogamy is the way to go. But I do think that there are other ways, so that's boom, stop that thought. I also think that there are other ways of getting Christians to, or probing Christians to think about non-monogamy and plurality. So when I was a graduate student, I took a class called Philosophical Theology, where we troubled the existence of a triune God, sort of like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and try to argue out of the perspective that that was not a polytheism, for example, right? Because we're supposed to understand this God, this anthropomorphic God figure as like a three-parted one thing. But then in other places in the Bible, they talk about the Holy Spirit as its own thing, or they talk about Jesus as his own thing, or they talk about God the Father as his own thing. And so I do think that these tensions do emerge even within the text themselves, but I don't think that many Christians run to those problems as a way of figuring those out to shore up their faith, which is what informs my, I guess my pessimism that I don't think that it will ever be sort of accepted by mainstream Christianity. So you have the identity portion, and then you have this way of like, okay, well, what if we goad them a little bit into their own text to show them, aside from the polygamy passages and saying like, you know, polygamy's here, right? They're just gonna go to the New Testament, or sorry, they're gonna go to Exodus and 10 Commandments and say, well, right here it says, but if we say, okay, well, cool, fine. What about like, you know, this triune God though? Like, am I cheating on God the Father with my relationship with God the Son? Like, is my relationship with God the Holy Spirit, you know what I'm saying? What about God the Father getting jealous of the Holy Spirit? You know, we don't, you know, jealousy doesn't come up in those contexts as often as it does in sort of conversations about non-monogamy, although I think that we could push there, right? I think at this point in my study, however, I've had far too many of those conversations, falling on ears not caring enough to really listen, you know, so Yeah, so no, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that many people would like. Yeah, then especially when we talk about matrimony, vows, all of these things are so deeply interwoven into the faith that to reject it, I mean, people would not know what to do with themselves, seriously, so.
All right, and then you'll probably be the last one.
My question is out the window, because I think that's way more interesting.
Yeah,
So also within Christianity and churches within Christianity that do accept polygamy,
Mhm.
like the Church of Latter-day Saints, it is one man and multiple women. And it is never the other way around if you want to be accepted by your church. So I think that has more to do with a very deep-rooted misogyny in Christianity than it has to do with them accepting polyamory.
Yeah, sure. And to also continue that, LDS and FLDS are on the fringes. They're not they're not quite the main,
Yeah.
right? And so you're right to point that out. I think I would have thought to also try to point that out, but for their existence on the fringes. So even if, do I ever think that they, even if they were to sort of like reject the misogyny, do I think that they could move into the mainstream? I think my answer on that would probably still be no,
It's that in like mainstream like Catholicism, right? If someone brought up the argument of Abraham and his wives, they would say that that was acceptable because it was Abraham and his wives. It wasn't a woman and her husband.
Yeah. That's real, yeah.
All right, well, we are perfectly at time, 1:30, so please join me in thanking our speakers. And